Ladies and gentlemen, the power of calm is often misunderstood, especially in a world that equates strength with volume, power with control, and influence with domination. We've been conditioned to believe that in order to be heard, we must shout. That to matter, we must fight. That leaving must look like slamming doors, yelling truths, and demanding accountability. But the truth is, there is a quiet kind of power one that doesn't need to prove itself, and it's in that stillness where true liberation begins. A super empath who chooses to leave a toxic relationship, especially with someone who thrives on control, does so not with rage but with resolution, not with drama but with dignity. That kind of exit, quiet, grounded, and certain, is unsettling to someone who expects chaos. It confuses them. They're waiting for the emotional fireworks, the begging, the bargaining, the confrontation that gives them a sense of power. But when none of that comes, when the empath just leaves, it creates a kind of silence they can't manipulate. And that silence is deafening. What we often fail to realize is that calm is not the absence of feeling, it's the presence of mastery. It is the culmination of sleepless nights, inner battles, silent prayers, and finally, the decision to choose oneself not out of ego, but out of self-preservation. For the super empath, calm does not mean they didn't feel deeply. Quite the opposite. It means they felt everything, they gave everything, and then they made peace with letting go. That calm exit isn't passive, it's the most active choice they've made in a long time. It's the moment they stop trying to fix what never wanted to be healed and start protecting their own spirit. What terrifies the narcissist is not the loss of the empath's affection, it's the loss of control over their emotional landscape. When someone who used to mirror their moods, cushion their rage, and excuse their behavior suddenly disengages, it reveals something powerful. The narcissist was never in control, they were simply given access. And now that access is revoked. Calm doesn't just mean leaving, it means closing the emotional door, locking it, and walking away with the key. There's a kind of threat that comes with calm because it's not reactionary. It's not about punishing or provoking. It doesn't play into the cycle of manipulation. It simply exits the game, and that's what breaks the cycle, not screaming matches or dramatic farewells, but the decision to no longer participate. That's what a calm exit represents. A refusal to be baited, a refusal to be broken. When a super empath reaches this place of calm, it's not because they suddenly stopped caring. It's because they've started caring about themselves just a little more. They've finally realized that being kind doesn't mean being available to abuse, that compassion doesn't mean sacrifice, and that staying in a relationship that chips away at your worth isn't loyalty, it's abandonment of self. Calm is a sacred space. It's where healing lives. It's where clarity replaces confusion. It's the internal shift from why won't they change to why am I still here. That shift isn't loud. It doesn't look like a scene. It looks like someone making breakfast the morning after they decided they're done. It looks like deleting a number without tears. It looks like walking out of a house that once felt like home, knowing that peace is worth more than history. The calm exit isn't just an action, it's a transformation. It signals the death of codependency and the birth of self-trust. It's where the empath steps out of the role of caretaker and into the role of creator of their own life, their own joy, their own safety. That calm is not weakness. It is the ultimate strength. It is restraint when retaliation is tempting. It is stillness when chaos calls your name. It is the whisper that says, you don't have to fight to be free, you just have to leave. And while the world may not applaud that quiet departure, and the narcissist may pretend it doesn't affect them, make no mistake it does. Because for someone who thrives on emotional dominance, the one thing they cannot handle is losing without a scene. The absence of drama is the absence of control, and that's what truly terrifies them, that the person they once underestimated is no longer playing along. Calm is power. It's the kind of power that doesn't need to explain itself. It just walks out the door and doesn't look back. Emotional boundaries are acts of courage, not walls of indifference. They are not about shutting people out, but about choosing who gets access to the most sacred parts of ourselves, our peace, our energy, our time, and our emotional safety. For the super empath, who feels everything deeply and often puts others first, learning to set emotional boundaries is a radical and brave act of self-preservation. It is an act of saying, I matter too. In relationships with narcissists, boundaries are often tested, ignored, or outright violated. Narcissists thrive in blurred lines. They push, prod, and manipulate until the empath begins to question their own needs, their own reality. Over time, the empath becomes conditioned to give more and more while receiving less and less. What starts as compassion slowly turns into compliance, and that compliance begins to erode the empath's sense of self. But something powerful happens when the empath wakes up, when they realize that loving someone doesn't mean tolerating mistreatment, that caring doesn't require self-sacrifice. It takes tremendous courage to say, I will not allow this behavior anymore. Because setting a boundary isn't just about drawing a line in the sand, it's about risking what happens when you do. It's about facing the discomfort of change, the fear of conflict, and the possibility of loss. For the empath, who often fears being seen as cold or unkind, boundaries can feel foreign and even selfish. But they are the most self-respecting thing one can do. They say, I am responsible for my own well-being, and I refuse to betray myself to keep the peace. That's what narcissists can't stand, that moment, when the empath stops negotiating their dignity. Because boundaries disrupt the power dynamic. They remove the narcissist's ability to dictate the emotional terms. What makes boundaries terrifying to those who seek control is that they're not up for debate. They don't require explanation, and they can't be manipulated. A clear boundary is like a mirror. It reflects back the truth of the relationship. And often that truth is uncomfortable. It says, the way you treat me isn't acceptable. And for someone who relies on emotional dominance, that statement is a threat. Because now, the empath isn't trying to please, they're trying to protect. And protection is powerful. It's what allows healing to begin. When the empath stops overfunctioning, stops absorbing blame, stops making excuses for behavior that hurts, they start to reclaim their worth. They begin to understand that love without respect isn't love at all, it's dependency dressed up as devotion. That realization doesn't come easily. It often comes after heartbreak, gaslighting, and exhaustion. But when it does, it changes everything. Boundaries are not a sign that the empath has stopped loving, they're a sign they've started loving themselves. They're not cold, they're not cruel, they're a declaration of what will and won't be allowed anymore. And yes, that might cause distance, it might lead to endings, but it also creates space for something far more sacred. Peace, authenticity, integrity, emotional safety. The act of setting emotional boundaries is not just about keeping others in check, it's about honoring your own capacity. It's knowing when your empathy becomes a liability, when your forgiveness becomes permission, when your patience becomes self-abandonment. That discernment is hard-earned. It comes from experience. It comes from pain. But most of all, it comes from bravery, and make no mistake, it takes bravery to enforce a boundary with someone who doesn't respect them. Narcissists will push back, they will guilt you, they will accuse you of being heartless, dramatic, or selfish. That's because your boundary exposes their behavior. It forces them to confront the fact that they no longer have the same access to your emotional world, that the door is closing, and this time, it won't be reopened just because they knock louder. But here's the thing, boundaries are not about controlling others. They are about controlling what you allow in. You cannot change someone who benefits from staying the same, but you can change what you tolerate. And that shift, that decision to protect your inner life is where freedom begins. For the super empath, emotional boundaries mark the beginning of a new chapter. One where giving doesn't mean depletion. One where kindness doesn't mean erasure. One where their depth and sensitivity are no longer exploited, but honored, and that starts by saying no when it's easier to say yes, by walking away when staying feels safer, by trusting that you don't need to explain your limits to anyone committed to crossing them. Emotional boundaries are acts of courage because they go against the grain of people, pleasing of fear-based attachment of keeping the peace at all costs. They require you to risk being misunderstood, disliked, or even alone. But they also ensure that the people who remain in your life are there because they honor you, not because they can control you. And that is the true power of a boundary. It doesn't just protect you from harm. It guides you back to yourself. Empathy is not compliance. It's not weakness. It's not surrender. Empathy is the ability to understand and feel what someone else is going through, to connect with their emotions, their perspective, and their pain. But what empathy is asterisk, not asterisk, is permission to be mistreated, manipulated, or controlled. Somewhere along the line, especially for deeply sensitive, intuitive people, super empaths, the lines got blurred. They began to believe that being empathetic meant staying silent, staying small, and staying in relationships that drained the very life out of them. But empathy doesn't require self-sacrifice. It doesn't demand that you remain in situations that violate your boundaries or erode your self-worth. It's entirely possible to have compassion for someone's pain and still refuse to excuse their harmful behavior. That's what healthy empathy looks like. It's rooted in strength, not submission. The challenge is that people who seek control, like narcissists, often weaponize empathy. They test it. They rely on it. They know that the empath will overextend, over-apologize, and overfunction. They count on it, because when empathy is unboundaried, it becomes a tool of manipulation. It makes the empath feel guilty for speaking up. It convinces them that holding someone accountable is unkind, and so they stay, they tolerate, they bend, until they forget who they are. But true empathy isn't about absorbing someone else's dysfunction. It's about understanding it without letting it consume you. It's about being able to say, I see why you are the way you are, and I can still say this behavior is not okay. That distinction is critical. Because when empathy becomes compliance, it stops being empathy and starts being self-abandonment. Compliance, in its essence, is rooted in fear, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as difficult, fear of being rejected. So the empath shrinks. They don't rock the boat. They make excuses for cruelty because they know the wounds behind it. But knowing someone's wounds doesn't mean you have to let them wound you. That's where the empath's power lies, in recognizing their ability to feel without losing themselves in the process. There is nothing noble about staying in toxic relationships just because you understand the other person's trauma. There is nothing compassionate about allowing your own emotional health to deteriorate so someone else can avoid accountability. Empathy doesn't mean accepting apologies without changed behavior. It doesn't mean staying quiet to keep the peace. Real empathy, grounded, mature empathy, holds space for love asterisk and asterisk limits. The turning point for many empaths comes when they begin to realize that their compassion has been used against them, that their deep desire to heal and help has been manipulated into a reason to stay stuck. This realization is painful. It often comes with a wave of grief and anger, not just at the other person, but at themselves. How did I let this happen? Why did I stay so long? But the answer isn't weakness. It's the beautiful and sometimes dangerous strength of empathy in a world that doesn't always honor it. When empaths reclaim their empathy from the grip of compliance, everything changes. They start to see that love and limits can coexist. That they can care for someone deeply and still say, no more. That empathy isn't about fixing others, it's about honoring the emotional truth of all people involved, including themselves. They stop confusing compassion with permission. They begin to separate understanding from tolerating. This shift is subtle but profound. It's when an empath can say, "I understand you and I choose me." It's when they stop internalizing someone else's pain as their responsibility. It's when they stop justifying dysfunction because they see the fear or trauma behind it. They start standing in their truth, calmly, clearly, without guilt, without needing the other person to understand or agree. And for someone who's been used to the empath's compliance, this change is unsettling. It breaks the pattern. It reveals the control. It threatens the dynamic, because now the empath isn't bending, isn't explaining, isn't justifying. They're simply not participating in the dysfunction anymore. That's the kind of quiet revolution that shifts the balance of power, and it begins when empathy is no longer mistaken for obedience. Empathy is a superpower when it's aligned with boundary. It can heal, connect, and transform, but without those boundaries, it can also entrap. And that's why reclaiming empathy, pulling it back from the edges of compliance, is an act of self-respect. It's the moment the empath says, "I will not betray myself in the name of compassion." So let the empath feel deeply. Let them love fully, but let them also say no. Let them walk away. Let them choose peace over performance. Let them understand without absorbing. That is empathy in its highest form, honest, discerning, and strong enough to know that love does not require the loss of self. Silence speaks louder than reaction, especially when it comes from someone who used to explain, defend, plead, and pour their heart out in the hope of being understood. When a super empath goes silent, it is not because they've run out of things to say. It's because they've finally realized that saying more won't change what refuses to hear. It's not about shutting down, it's about shutting off the emotional tap that's been feeding a relationship built on imbalance. For someone who thrives on control like a narcissist, silence from an empath is jarring. They're used to reactions, whether it's pain, anger, confusion, or attempts to fix things. They're used to emotional engagement because engagement, even in conflict, means access. But silence, that means the game is over. The power play ends when the other person stops playing. Silence removes the supply, the fuel, the emotional feedback that narcissists rely on to maintain their sense of importance. It creates a void they can't control, and that void is what unnerves them most. To the empath, silence is not a passive act. It is an intentional one. It's a line in the sand that says, "I've said everything I could. I've tried every way I know how. Now I choose peace." It takes incredible strength to resist the urge to explain yourself one more time, to clear up one more misunderstanding, to respond to one more provocation. Silence is the final boundary. It's the realization that the more you speak, the more you are drawn into a dynamic that thrives on emotional chaos. So you stop, and in that stillness, something powerful happens. You begin to hear yourself. Without the noise of gaslighting, blame, shifting, or emotional manipulation, your own inner voice becomes louder. Clarity starts to rise. You realize that your worth was never tied to your ability to make someone else understand or treat you better. It was always there, waiting for you to stop giving it away to someone who couldn't see it. Silence is not cold, it's not cruel, it's not about punishing the other person. It's about protecting your energy. It's about withdrawing your emotional investment from a situation that has only depleted you. It's about stepping out of the cycle where your reactions became the currency of control. When the narcissist can no longer provoke you into justifying, explaining, or defending yourself, they lose their grip. And what they fear most isn't your anger, it's your indifference. Because indifference is not the opposite of hate, it's the absence of attachment. It says, "I'm done," not with bitterness, but with finality. It's the empath standing in their own power, not needing validation, not needing closure, just choosing peace over performance. That kind of silence is terrifying to someone who believed they could always draw you back in with the right mix of guilt, charm, or chaos. Many empaths struggle with silence at first. They equate it with abandonment or conflict avoidance. But over time, they begin to see it for what it really is, a sanctuary. It's where healing begins. It's where the nervous system calms. It's where the cycle of emotional labor ends. And once you feel that peace, once you realize you don't need to react, to respond, to explain, you begin to reclaim parts of yourself that you lost trying to be heard. Silence doesn't mean you don't care. It means you've cared too much for too long, and now you're choosing to care for yourself. It means you've reached the point where your inner peace matters more than being understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. That shift is not just about emotional maturity, it's about survival. It's about protecting your mental, emotional, and even physical well-being. In toxic dynamics, especially with narcissists, silence is often the only language they can't manipulate. Words can be twisted, tears can be used against you, anger can be reframed as instability. But silence leaves nothing to grab onto. It's clean, it's clear, it's unarguable. It removes the hooks, the bait, the invitation to re-enter the emotional arena. And it sends the message, I'm not available for this anymore. When an empath gets quiet, it's not because they've become cold, it's because they've become wise. They've learned that peace is not found in fixing others, but in letting go. They've realized that their voice matters, but it doesn't need to be wasted on ears that refuse to listen. They've understood that not every story needs a dramatic ending. Some just need a dignified exit. So when silence falls, don't mistake it for weakness. It is one of the strongest choices an empath can make. It is the space where healing breathes, where dignity lives, where self-worth is no longer up for negotiation. And yes, it may go unnoticed by others, but to the one who chose it, it speaks volumes. Silence is the sound of a soul returning to itself, and that is louder than any reaction ever could be. Shame can't stick to someone who's healed. That doesn't mean they haven't felt it, carried it, or been shaped by it. It means they've met it head on, sat with its weight, traced its origins, and decided, once and for all, that it no longer gets to define who they are. Shame is a powerful force. It's sneaky, insidious, and it thrives in silence. But when a person chooses healing, when they start peeling back the layers of who they've been told they are versus who they truly are, shame loses its grip. People who weaponize shame, narcissists, manipulators, emotionally immature individuals, count on it to keep others small. They use it like a leash, a subtle look of disapproval, a dismissive tone, a cruel comment wrapped in concern. And for someone who hasn't healed, it works. It hits like a punch to the chest. It makes them second, guess, apologize unnecessarily, and try harder to please. But for someone who's done the work, who's sat in the mess and rebuilt themselves from the ground up, that same tactic no longer works. The shame just slides off. Healing isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It's about facing your history without letting it dictate your future. It's standing in front of the mirror and refusing to accept someone else's projection as your truth. Healed people still remember the sting of shame, but they no longer live inside it. They've stopped taking responsibility for the emotional immaturity of others. They've stopped absorbing blame for things that were never theirs to carry. They've stopped shrinking to make others feel more comfortable. What changes in healing is the internal narrative. Where there used to be self-doubt, there's now clarity. Where there used to be apology, there's now quiet resolve. And most importantly, where there used to be shame, there's now self-compassion. That shift doesn't make someone invulnerable, but it does make them immovable in the face of manipulation. A narcissist may still try to provoke guilt or embarrassment, but the healed empath sees through it. They no longer internalize the guilt trips or the passive-aggressive comments. They recognize them for what they are, attempts to control. The reason shame no longer sticks is because healing brings ownership. When you've owned your story, the beautiful, the broken, the brave, there's nothing left for someone to weaponize. You've already said, yes, that happened. Yes, I've made mistakes. Yes, I've been hurt, and I've grown through all of it. Shame only holds power in secrecy. Once your truth is no longer hidden, it becomes a source of strength. It becomes your armor, and this is what makes healed people dangerous to those who once held power over them. Because once shame stops working, so does control. You stop reacting, you stop over-explaining, you stop carrying emotional burdens that don't belong to you. You walk away without the lingering voice saying, "Was it me?" because you've finally learned to separate your worth from other people's projections. Healing isn't linear and it's not easy. It often requires facing parts of yourself that you'd rather avoid. It means grieving who you were before you knew better. It means forgiving yourself for what you allowed when you didn't know your own value. But it also means freedom, because once you've crossed that threshold, once you've looked shame in the face and said, "You don't get to live here anymore," your life changes. You begin to move differently. You speak more calmly because you no longer feel the need to prove yourself. You take up space without apology. You trust your intuition even when it's inconvenient. And when someone tries to pull you back into the shame spiral, when they use the same old tactics to make you feel small, you simply don't respond. Not because you're avoiding, but because you're done participating in games that once kept you stuck. There's something unshakable about a person who's healed, not loud, not aggressive, just grounded. There's a quiet confidence in someone who has walked through fire and emerged whole. They don't need to fight to be seen. They've already seen themselves, and no one, not a narcissist, not an abuser, not an old voice from the past, can take that away. Shame can't live in the same place as truth. It can't grow where there's light. And healed people, they've let the light in. They've opened the windows, cleared the cobwebs, and named the pain. And now there's simply no room left for shame to cling to. It has nowhere to hide. So when you see someone walking away quietly, when you see them unbothered by the opinions and judgments of those who once held power over them, know this. That is what healing looks like, not showy. Not loud, just free, and when you reach that place, when your truth becomes louder than their shame, you'll feel it, you'll breathe easier, and no matter who tries to throw your past in your face, it simply won't stick. Because it's not who you are anymore. It never was, and now, finally, you know that too. It is not about revenge, it's about wholeness. It's about finally choosing yourself in a world that taught you to choose everyone else first. It's about turning the page without slamming the book shut, not because you're angry, but because you've outgrown the story. For the super empath, leaving a toxic dynamic, especially one woven with the manipulation and chaos of a narcissist, is never just about walking away. It's a reclamation of self, of peace, of power. When someone has spent years being emotionally contorted, silenced, second, guessed, or drained, the idea of leaving might feel radical. At first, it can even look like an act of defiance. From the outside, and certainly in the eyes of the narcissist, the calm departure can be mistaken for payback. But make no mistake, this kind of it isn't driven by bitterness, it's driven by clarity. It's what happens when the empath sees the patterns, the cycles, the gaslighting, and decides that healing matters more than holding on. Revenge seeks to hurt. Wholeness seeks to heal, and healing is the quiet force behind every true escape from emotional abuse. The empath doesn't want to harm anyone. They just don't want to be harmed anymore. They don't want to destroy the other person's world. They just want to rebuild their own. That distinction is everything. Because revenge keeps you tied to the pain. It keeps you tethered to the wound. But wholeness is liberation. It's a forward motion. It's rising up and walking out with your dignity intact, even when your heart is heavy. In the early stages of awakening, it's common for the empath to feel an urge to prove a point, to show the narcissist what they lost, to be seen, to be validated, to be heard. But in time, They learn that true healing doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need an explanation. It doesn't even need the other person to understand. Wholeness doesn't seek revenge because it no longer seeks approval. It no longer craves closure from the one who created the wound. There's immense power in walking away quietly, in not arguing, in not pleading, in not defending yourself anymore. That kind of calm exit is not weakness, it's evidence of growth. It says, I don't need to convince you. I just need to take care of me. That's the energy of someone who has stopped outsourcing their peace to someone else's behavior. It's the moment the empath finally stops dancing in circles around someone else's ego and begins to walk in a straight line toward freedom. The narcissist often expects a reaction, expects drama, confrontation, begging, or emotional chaos. They prepare for war, but the empath leaves like a breeze, soft, steady, and gone. And that's what unsettles the narcissist the most. Not the rage, not the tears, but the silence, the stillness, the certainty, because in that silence the narcissist can no longer feel in control. There's no thread to pull, no hook to use, no guilt to manipulate. The game ends not with a bang, but with a boundary. Wholeness means no longer needing to prove how much you were hurt. It means no longer sacrificing your emotional well-being to make things work. It means learning to listen to your nervous system, to the knots in your stomach, the tightness in your chest, the fatigue in your soul, and choosing peace over persistence. The empath doesn't leave to punish. They leave to protect what's left of themselves and to reclaim what they had forgotten, their worth. And here's what most don't see: the eggs. It isn't the beginning of healing, it's the result of it. The decision to leave was preceded by countless internal battles, nights filled with self-doubt, questions like, am I the problem? Or maybe I'm just too sensitive. Leaving took courage. It took grieving the fantasy of what could have been. It took unlearning the belief that love must be earned through suffering. So when the empath walks, it's not spontaneous. It's the final chapter of a story they've been quietly rewriting. Wholeness is not loud. It doesn't need to declare its presence. It's felt in the way the empath no longer reacts, in the way they stop explaining their decisions, in the way they create distance without drama, in the way they prioritize their healing over being liked or understood. And eventually that inner peace becomes louder than any external noise. That's when the world shifts. That's when the empath starts building a life that isn't about survival but about thriving. So no, the exit isn't about revenge. It's not about making the other person hurt the way you did. It's not about proving a point. It's about coming home to yourself. It's about realizing that your energy is sacred, and anyone who repeatedly violates it doesn't deserve access to it. It's about knowing that peace isn't found in fixing others, it's found in honoring yourself. And when you leave from that place grounded, whole, clear, the world feels different. You begin to trust yourself again. You begin to breathe deeper, smile wider, rest more, because now you're no longer performing for love or shrinking to fit. You're living from a place of wholeness, and nothing and no one can take that from you.